Hey Eric, how's it going? Great to see you.
Good, good. Thanks for having me, Brooke.
Yeah, super excited to have you on. So I'm here with Eric, who is the founding PM at Cartesia, and I'm super excited to be chatting with him today because we do a lot of voice evaluation at Cobalt. And one of the biggest questions that we get from our users is which TTS provider should I be using and how should I be choosing all the different voice models? So super excited to dive into that today with Eric and kind of explore all the different things that you should be considering when choosing your voice provider. Eric, we'd love to hear an intro on your side and kind of what you're up to at Cartesia.
Brooke, yeah, I'm Eric here at Cartesia. And Cartesia, we're building the future of voice AI. To us means ultra realistic, ultra fast, and very controllable voice models. So starting with that, like we built what we think is like the best text-to-speech model on the market. And happy to chat a little bit more about how we think about what good looks like and what we've seen working with some of our customers.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, controllability is, I think, a really exciting concept. So excited to dive into that as well as a bunch of other things with you. At a high level, though, I think since voice is so new, I think a lot of people are still learning about like what are all the components today. So really at a high level, where Cartesia sits is at the text-to-speech layer. And so in cascading architectures, kind of as opposed to voice-to-voice architectures, you have a variety of pretty standard components. So you have kind of the voice orchestration, handling, and then all the voice infrastructure. So how do you actually make the call happen and all of the data transfer that happens with SIP and all these other telephony, etc. And then and beyond that, you have speech to text. So how do you actually take the user's voice and then convert it into text that you can then pass to an LLM, run LLM calls to be able to actually generate the logic, and then pass that back to a text-to-speech provider like Cartesia or some of the others like OpenAI, 11 Labs, Google's models, etc., and actually convert that back into speech so that you can respond to the user. And so I think one of the hard parts of voice AI today is because everything is moving so fast in that you have so many models across the board. So unlike traditional LLM applications, there's actually not just one where you have to decide what model you're using for LLMs, but also whether you're using for transcription, whether you're using for your voice, whether you're using for turn detection. And so I think it's quite a maze, especially as you're starting out. So excited to dive into how you kind of choose from all these different models and think about the architecture decisions there. So Eric, what are you seeing as what people consider when they're choosing between different voice providers? Like what are some of the things that people should consider?
Yeah, totally. And to your point about like different architectures and like what this voice stack kind of looks like, I do think this will change over time, right? To be clear, like right now, like Cartesia, for instance, is like very focused, like getting to be the best text-to-speech model, right? But we do think that generally voice AI and audio AI, how things will be built will change quite a bit over time. But the nice thing is working backwards from like what good looks like, ideally at like the highest level, what good looks like is a little bit more consistent, right? So like, for instance, if you're building something that is touching an end user, for instance, through like automated phone calls, right? Naturalness is kind of still naturalness regardless of like what that stack looks like. And you can imagine over time, like in many other industries, like the implementation changes as the technology gets better, but kind of good still looks the same, right? And like very high level, like when I think about what a good quality of service looks like for something like a text-to-speech model in the context of these like both either conversational agents or creative voice use cases, really comes down to like model quality, cost, and maybe enterprise readiness, depending on your specific use cases.
Yeah.
Happy to dive into each of those.
Yeah, definitely. I think what you're alluding to is there's definitely this, I think, big looming question of when do we switch to speech-to-speech models, or when do these kind of architectures of this cascading voice architecture change as the speech-to-speech models get even better? Do you think that people will be switching entirely to speech-to-speech models, or do you think that there will be kind of a pairing of speech-to-speech with like other background architectures, or like what's kind of your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to predict a lot of these things, especially like once you start looking at like a few years out, right? I think one of the things that, again, I think about a lot is the way you evaluate and think about like what good outputs of like this kind of abstracted black box should kind of be consistent over time, right? So like, this is definitely going to be trivializing it, but at some point in theory, the point of kind of turnover to a speech-to-speech model is when kind of the quality bar is at parity or better than like this kind of cascading model, and then you have incentive to make a switch, right? Latency or cost or whatever the justification is, right? So it's just like the benefits need to outweigh the costs, right? And I think part of that is investing in the right tooling and like process to think about what good looks like, and so you can measure kind of the benefit, right, or the cost, and then also thinking about like what you actually want out of such a transition, right? I think maybe to answer this question backwards, like a mistake would be to transition to like a speech-to-speech model for the sake of using a speech-to-speech model, right? When you can't really quantify why it's better, and even more scarily, like if you can't quantify why it's worse, right? And then discovering that in production, I think it just doesn't make that much sense.
Totally. I feel like the strength of your evals or the process of going through and creating your evals is actually a really important product experience because you're thinking about what does good look like, what are we optimizing against, what are we optimizing for? And I think that can be a really important discovery process as you're choosing from all these different trade-offs. You start to think about what are really the key metrics that we're trying to drive because there's so many different vectors and trade-offs that you can make along the way. And many of them are very fuzzy where you don't know how a model is really going to perform in your system until you actually deploy it. So what do you see people really looking into when they are choosing between different models, and what are kind of the driving considerations at a high level that you think or questions that people should be asking?
Yeah, maybe I'll break this into like three like high level buckets, right? One is just quality, right? And quality maybe is kind of model quality in terms of, and this is specifically on the text-to-speech side of things for now, right? But model quality would be, okay, how good are your generations, right? So generally that could be, do I like how this sounds? Does this follow the transcript I'm giving it? Does it hallucinate? And then does it generate basically what I want it to sound like, right? Like to your point, some of that is maybe objectively measurable, right? So a transcript you can break down. It's like, does it say the thing that's written in the transcript and nothing else? But other things like, does this follow the intonations I want? Does it have the pacing or like kind of prosody I want? It's a little bit more subjective sometimes, right? But that's generally how people think about kind of quality of the generations. And then you have quality of the voices, right? Which is, in theory, you can have the same model, generate the same transcript, and it, for instance, can follow the transcript perfectly. But does like the voice that you're using match the use case or your quote unquote taste, right? And part of that comes down to like the voice library of, can you go into the provider's library and pick a voice that matches your needs, right? Some providers have just a fixed set of kind of a handful of voices. If none of them fit your needs, they don't fit your needs. Some other providers like ourselves provide cloning, right? And then it's a matter of how well can you actually clone the voice and like kind of reliably produce what you want it to sound like. With our new model, we actually think this is like best in class, kind of by far. We did like a blinded holdout eval against some of our top competitors, and luckily had a Beck's preference from these blind raters. But like depending on how you want to approach this problem of what voice am I using, whether it's off the shelf voices or cloning, that's something people evaluate you on. And then the last thing is actually controllability and usability, right? So controllability being things like speed, emotion control, pausing, spelling. Being able to explicitly control that is obviously very, very important, right? Especially when you have complex transcripts, you want to make sure that you don't read people's like confirmations numbers wrong, right? You want to make sure that when you want the voice model to spell out something, you can tell it to do so and it does it reliably. You want to be able to control when it does or does not have pauses between paragraphs or sentences, right? All of these things are, again, to different levels of importance for different use cases and customers. But these are like the dimensions against which I think people tend to evaluate quality. Yeah. And then outside of quality, right, the two other things are like a little bit more straightforward. Like one is kind of the service quality, right? It's like latency reliability. It's like, are you getting the models and responses fast enough, right? Especially for phone call, real-time use cases, latency becomes super important. And the reliability is also as important, if not more important. It's like, okay, great. If your like lowest latency is X, but you can't really deliver on it in any reliable way, that's also like practically useless, right? So making sure you evaluate both of those is really important. And then the last thing is kind of obviously cost, right? And that's a little bit more straightforward to model out. I think the main distinction I've seen in the past is thinking about like how you basically scale, and maybe there's different phases of like a customer's life cycle, right? Maybe in some cases you care a little bit more about unit economics. In other cases, you maybe care a little bit more about like min spend commitment type of situations, right? But like in general, thinking about costs, I think is a little bit more straightforward than the other two. And then I guess one last thing that I forgot is like actual enterprise readiness, right? So like one thing that's really exciting about the voice AI space this year is that in some ways it's like quite nascent, right? At least like this new wave of companies, right? So you have a lot of builders right now who are still like relatively small, right? But the thing is, you want to kind of skate towards where the puck is going, right? And I think one of the challenges there is that, okay, what if you do really well, right? Which is obviously the thing that you're hoping for. Then that means you sell to bigger and bigger customers who have more and more stringent requirements, right? Whether that be like on-prem deployment or like other types of compliance, or maybe even running models on device, right? Like you want to have a provider that kind of scales with you and like in the limit, like doesn't cap you, right? And I think that's like kind of the last thing that a lot of people like try and consider, especially if you're targeting like enterprise use cases.
Yeah, definitely. And I think setting yourself up so that you also like it doesn't, you can setting yourself up so that you're able to scale to those use cases is super important. I think latency is definitely the biggest one that I think we see for a lot of use cases where because latency is such a problem across the voice stack, like anywhere where you can shave down latency just is a huge win in terms of how responsive your agent feels and therefore how attentive, how natural, etc. it feels. I think so. Latency, I think, is where people is table stakes, where people care a lot, especially if you're doing outbound sales, where just staying on the phone, getting people to stay on the phone for a few more seconds actually can be the difference between them picking up your phone and not. Same with like inbound appointment scheduling or being able to, get data from a claims provider. All of these use cases, if you can like get the words out fast enough, you're more likely to keep the other person on the phone. And then I think the controllability is a really exciting piece that Cartesia has, where being able to control what's mostly a black box model is really helpful because I think for some cases, the same thing that could be a bug in some cases where you're speaking too quickly or you're interrupting the user too much, or you're saying a lot of ums and ahs might actually be a feature in other use cases. So for example, being more conversational or sounding less polished can be great if you're an interviewer or if you're trying to just like chat with someone and have them practice their sales skills. And then on the flip side, being not super polished can make it seem really bad for an enterprise client that's looking for this more polished brand voice. And so I think this idea of the UX design of voice experiences is super exciting, where as you look through all these different voice models, like how you kind of build up this brand and piece together interruptions and voice and casual versus more polished, etc., can really build out a brand that fits your company.
For sure. One of the really interesting things about being like the voice AI provider and platform provider here is our goal is to provide you with the right set of tools, customize and control the things that you build to optimize for your specific use case, right? And like to your example, like one example of this might be, okay, for now, like the kind of most naive implementation of this would be, let me just pick a speed that works generally best for like my whole population. Over time, that might be personalizing speed for a specific user and like personalizing, obviously like language and accents and all of these things are things that you as like a builder should be able to do, right? And like it's on us to help you provide you the tools to do that, right? Additionally, obviously, like we work very, very closely with our customers and kind of are learning across the industry of like, oh, how do you actually do some of these things, right? And obviously that informs what we build in terms of, oh, turns out disfluencies matter, right? And we might want to include that in like the way we train our models and making sure that we're training models that are particularly good at X thing, right? But also we can feed that back into our customers. Okay, well, if you're doing these natural phone calls, here are some tips and tricks, right? On like how to do this versus if you're trying to make some like super polished advertisement for like the Super Bowl or something like that, right? Maybe ahs, and likes isn't something that you would really want to spend $1 million a second on, right? So all of these things to say that I think being a platform provider is really interesting right now because there's a lot of leverage across the market, but also the market is not like necessarily exactly consistent, right, across what everyone wants. So a lot of the art on our end is picking like the right set of knobs to expose rather than to help our customers set those knobs properly.
Totally. Being able to balance kind of the simplicity of being able to allow your users to control things while also not making it too complicated that then you can all of a sudden get into some crazy voices. I think also Cartesia's or TTS in general is at probably the most creative part of the stack where you're half art, half science, where like transcription on one side there's a lot more objective measures of, did it transcribe the words correctly or not? Whereas on the other side with the voice, there's something to be said for a word error rate and are you saying all the words that you should be saying out loud? But there's so much creativity around intonation. Where do you pause? Where do you show excitement versus anger versus disappointment? Where do you pause? Where do you breathe? How have you guys been thinking about like allowing controllability of those things? Where do you think the industry is going in that perspective?
Yeah, I think, maybe one thing I'm working backwards is like when we say like the industry, I actually think there's like many different industries, right? Like again, like this whole landscape, I think is changing quite quickly, right?
Yeah.
And at the very least, there's like a few kind of distinct areas. For instance, content generation is one end, right? And like conversation is the other end. It's maybe not like this one-dimensional spectrum, right? But like in general, these are in my mind quite distinct in that like their needs are quite distinct, right? But in terms of controllability, it goes back to my point on From our end, we think that we have a huge edge in like the models we're able to build, and that allows us to some extent to try and target a lot of these by building the best models. And then it's about building the right interface from these models to support each of these kind of potentially distinct use cases. But in general, in terms of controllability, like where we've landed today is there's like a few things that are like obviously important, right? One is speed, or when I say speed, I mean pacing. So take the same voice, take the same transcript, say it faster or slower. And it's not just about like generate the audio and then just like play it back at 2x speed, right? It's about how do you still naturally produce from this specific voice, but just produce it at a quicker pace. That's one thing. The second is emotional control. We have some level of emotional control now. It's an area that we could continue to be very excited about. Right? And you can imagine that obviously there's some level of like inferring emotion from context in the transcript and both the thing that's being said, but also like the transcript around it. But also like there is benefit to having explicit emotional control. And we do have that today and continue to work on improving it. And I think the last thing that we find quite interesting is actual, like, I guess you could call this control, but like having truly state-of-the-art cloning, one could argue is the most general form of control, right? So I'll give you like an example of this, which is we think that with our cloning, which we think is best, not only are you controlling the way the voice sounds, you're controlling the way it generates audio, right? Whether that's like the prosody, the pacing, the pausing. I've done a lot of internal experiments around how does a voice that's maybe optimized for like ASMR / bedtime stories differ from maybe like a person who does all of the auctioneer voice, right? Where they're just like rambling through all the numbers. I think like just having the ability to control at the voice level and then have fine control via kind of API / like tool level inputs, I think seems to be the right abstraction right now. Of course, like this view might change over time and we're going to kind of continue to learn from our customers. But like for now, this is where we've landed. And a lot of our customers have really, really enjoyed all of these.
I think this is like one of the most underutilized areas actually, is that you can have so many gains in naturalness just by creating a very unique voice that comes from, building out your own voice and really differentiate you as a company, but also it can, create exactly the kind of casual or polished sound that you're looking for. So I feel like that's a really cool area that maybe not as many people have explored. What are some of so in addition to voice cloning, what are some ways that you can provide controllability or tips and tricks for how you can get the voice model to say things slower or say more emphasis in certain areas? I've heard a lot of people trying out we've seen a couple people trying out different ways of signaling to the speech to text not speech to text.
Yes, text to speech, yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious if you have any tips or tricks around controlling the voice models from more of a text input perspective. So we've seen a lot of success around providing text input with like ... or adding spaces to make it say the text more slowly. What have you seen work well in terms of being able to signal where you want the emphasis in text?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few options here, right? I think to your examples, like I think both of those are valid, and I've seen like reasonable success with them, right? Like adding more exclamation marks or ... or spelling things out explicitly. All of these are like kind of the prompt engineering type of solutions, and like as with anything that's kind of like at that layer, I think especially in kind of like a orchestrated conversational agent example, right? Anytime one part of the system changes, potentially there are a lot of like downstream effects. Just in general, I think that's something to like make sure you have good evals around. But in addition to that, I think there's a few other things that I think are nice, especially when it comes to naturalness. We've seen that disfluencies, like filler words, like work really, really well with kind of crossing the uncanny valley type of situation, where a lot of our customers explicitly obviously have this in their transcript generation step, right? And we have actually gotten feedback that people can't even tell this is like an AI, right? And it's partially because obviously we think the voice and model are great, but also because our users are using them kind of properly, right? In addition to that, obviously there's like the explicit controls I talked about. And then the last thing that I forgot to mention in the last section is using kind of spelling and pause controls as well. Like we have these as explicit tags, right? Where, for instance, if you have a word that you want to spell out, obviously sometimes if you just wrote out like Brooke, for instance, the model would just read Brooke, right? But if you wanted to spell out your name, for instance, to like fill out a form over the phone, you can just add spell tags and the model will like explicitly read out whatever the phrase or word you're trying to spell out. And similar with pausing, right? So you can imagine, especially for like kind of creative use cases, sometimes for emphasis, you want to pause, right? In the middle of like an audiobook or podcast or whatever it is. And with a very kind of simple pause tag, you can just inject breaks. Again, we'll continue to add more explicit controls as we find them to be valuable, right? But for now, I think these are the main tips and tricks that I've seen at the transcript level. And then I'll continue to emphasize that I do think there's a lot of headroom in improving on the cloning and voice level, because a lot of kind of these characteristics are inherited, right? And you are somewhat bounded by like the voice that you start with.
Totally. Yeah. And I think the like being able to play around with these and then run a bunch of cases to actually see how this plays out across 100 different cases is really valuable, because you can start to see like how often am I actually pausing, or does it actually come up with, extra, hallucinated words instead of the more natural sounds that I was looking for. And I think Cartesia does like something that we've seen when running our evals has been like, Cartesia does a great job with these filler words, such as saying, oh, or yeah, these things that really cross the uncanny valley. There are a couple of examples where like saying different dollar signs or monetary signs out loud that I've been really impressed, where it will actually swap the order of things, which I think sounds pretty obvious when you're reading through a text, but actually being able to read the words out of order. There have been some other examples, like as well as with like large numbers, etc., is actually a really hard problem that we've seen people struggling with over the past few months. So it's exciting to see Cartesia kind of make headroom in that, which is super cool. What have you seen as kind of the areas where what have you seen as the different areas where different voices make sense? Like, I think something we see a lot is that 80% of the voice use cases right now, at least the ones that we're seeing, we're obviously more focused on agents. So we don't see as many of like podcasting or video overlays or gaming experiences. We're much more focused on objective, task-oriented agents. But it's been really interesting to me that so many agents fall into like 80% of agents fall into a very few number of categories, like job interviewers, customer service, sales representatives, healthcare professionals, like back office, kind of appointment handling and scheduling. And I think this is awesome because it kind of creates a lot of opportunity for model companies to get really good at these specific use cases. I know that Cartesia is building very general foundational models. How do you kind of think about these different use cases and in your roadmap towards a more foundational model direction?
Yeah. So yeah, like you said, I think the current market within the subset of like the voice AI market that is kind of agent specific, right, tends to cluster into like a handful of like high level use cases. I think that's like natural in any like new market like this. But like you also said, Cartesia is very much focused on like being the voice AI platform for like everyone. And again, I think part of the reason we believe that is possible for us is because of our modeling and infrastructure kind of expertise. Right. So the hope is that we should be able to build models and like serve models that are just good for everyone. Right. But to your point about use cases, it's still obviously from like a product perspective helpful to enumerate these use cases so that I don't just have to believe that the model is better for them. I can actually see and measure that it's better. Right. So I think at the model training level, like first talking about the subset that is like these not constrained, but these like finite set of like top use cases for conversational agents. The nice thing is like, you can enumerate a lot of what you would consider realistic transcripts or use cases for them, right? Like if you're doing claims, obviously there's like small variations within them, but like the chain of the conversation follows like a reasonably rigorous tree. And obviously you can have some like variance in the specific transcript or what the person says, but obviously you can't exhaustively enumerate these things, but you can get a pretty representative set of like test cases to work on. And then you can also get some like reasonable metrics to measure them on, right? So there's like subset of metrics that are kind of objectively easy to interpret and trust to some extent, like word error rate and those types of things. And there are some things that you just have to label with like human evaluation, right? And maybe you can build some metrics that are like super tailored to them, right? So this is generally what we do for like specific use cases, whether they be conversational agents or not, which is let's think about how our customers are going to use them. Let's think about how our customers and maybe their users will consider, what do they consider as good and bad, right? And again, like sometimes these things are actually conflicting. And this is where like model flexibility, model generability is like super important, right? Like I'll give you a very concrete example is maybe in certain phone call situations, you actually want to have a voice that almost sounds like it's in the call center, right? There's some background noise. It's like over the phone. It's like kind of grainy, right? And then it has all of these like filler words. But if you like gave that same audio to someone who said like, this is like the audio for my movie that I just generated, they'd be like, this is really bad, right? But also vice versa. If you gave someone like a super polished, like studio like voice for a phone call, they're like, this is like obviously AI, right? And I think the thing for us is like enumerating all of these as like somewhat unique things that we care about, making sure we measure them as we build our models. And then like once we release a new model, which like will inherently be better at all of these things, hopefully, right? We still need to like build products and kind of downstream things, right? To like kind of really fulfill the needs of our customers until our models kind of fully get there, right? But in general, like, I think the nice thing is you can enumerate a lot of representative transcripts to test against. And then obviously working very closely with your customers to get that true feedback loop of let's actually try this voice in a specific use case and look at phone call duration or conversion rates and all of those things. And I think that's where working really closely with our customers has been obviously very critical to building something people want.
Totally. Yeah, I think benchmarks, people often get upset when people can get frustrated when benchmarks are overly relied on or serve as a definitive, winner for who is the best model. But I think that in voice, it's especially apparent that benchmarks are only a way to sift through the noise and really see, like, at a high level, which 2 or 3 models should I be looking at for my specific use case before you actually are running your task-specific evals in your system, in your context, on your use case. But I think that's especially apparent with voice because there's so much of taste and preference and brands or like how you're building the UX of your voice experience.
Yeah. And one thing like that I think Cobalt has done really well is like thinking through how to even like personalize these benchmarks a little bit to specific customers, right? Like a very extreme example of this is there are leaderboards, whether that's for text to speech or otherwise. Like you can look at the things if you just spent 5 minutes and like double clicked into like what are the, for instance, in text to speech, what are the transcripts you're running? If those transcripts don't sound like what you're going to use the text to speech engine for, does it really matter? Right? And like the reality is like it's easy enough to run quote unquote benchmarks yourself by like just logging into the playground and just putting in 5 transcripts that you would personally use, right? And I would argue that listening to 10 of those is probably more representative than trusting like some arbitrary number that like you don't know like what statistical backflips were done, right, to like arrive at some conclusion. In this case, because it's so subjective, like simpler is a little bit better, at least for now.
I think the combination of really strong metrics, and this is something that we think about a lot at Cobalt, is how can you combine really strong metrics that then allow you to go through things manually at like 10x or 100x speed? So not that you're never actually touching the results or the evals, but that you can use these benchmarks or use these metrics as a way to get to an answer faster. You guys just released a huge model today. What are you most excited about?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's an exciting day for us, right? Because we get to see our customers use this new model that we think is like excellent, right? I think very, very specifically, a few of the things that I think are like greatly improved are number one, transcript following, which is obviously huge for a lot of the kind of call center conversational agent use cases, right? Again, you don't want to read someone's confirmation number wrong, or you don't want to read the dosage of someone's like medical prescription wrong. All of those things are super critical. And our model now is like highly, highly accurate on these things, right? And not only is it accurate, it's incredibly natural, right? So I think that's something that's really hard to do well. So transcript following is a big one. The second one is actual voice cloning. So like we talked about a little bit, I do think that like the voice level control is something that is like generally underutilized, and a big unlock for users and customers to utilize cloning as a control knob for like how their generation sound is you actually need excellent cloning, right? And this is something we've spent a lot of time doing, and we've seen in kind of blinded evaluations that we're kind of strongly preferred over all the top leading providers. And we're very excited to get this in the hands of our customers. And I think the last thing is, I think in general, we pride ourselves on not only being an excellent modeling company, but like an excellent engineering and product company. And a big part of that is making sure that the infrastructure to serve what we consider the best models is also the best, right? And so looking at things, obviously like latency, but also looking at reliability of our service and the consistency of our latency, looking at not only like the P50 latency value, but all the way up to like P75, P90, P99, right? Making sure that we're excellent across the board, and making sure that like when we sign contracts and work with customers, we're able to make certain types of agreements that I think are super critical to like ultra critical enterprise use cases, right? Whether that be latency, SLAs, or concurrency, or even like on-prem offerings. Like this is, at least to me, like a big step in the direction of Cartesia clearly being like the enterprise-ready voice AI provider. Not only are the models the best, not only are the voices the best, but like you being able to actually grow with Cartesia to like with no ceiling is like kind of the company we want to build.
Totally. Along those lines of like, as people are looking forward towards the future of where voice is going, how can they best position themselves from an architecture perspective around moving from more of this cascading architecture to what feels inevitable around speech to speech, where like, how should people be thinking about their design decisions now that will best set them up to be able to do that in the future?
Yeah, I think there's a few things, right? Like I'll start with evals as like the first, right? Like first understanding what good looks like and then formalizing that in test, right? Whether and that's to your point previously, like a combination of like the test cases, right? Like can you enumerate the things that you want the system to do? And then in those cases, can you describe and ideally formalize like in code what good or bad looks like, or a good and or bad looks like, right? That's I think the most scalable and kind of something that is like useful like in perpetuity, right? Like really understanding that. And a lot of that is somewhat objective, right? Of like, okay, don't say the thing wrong, but some of that is also taste. And that taste is what I think kind of product taste might be in this future of like conversational AI design, right? Of what does your brand look like from a pacing, voice quality, kind of all of these dimensions, right? Like you kind of need to formalize that. That's the first thing. What that will allow you to do is when it becomes time to make that potentially inevitable transition, you want to be able to make that decision fast and clearly, right? It's like someone is telling me that this speech to speech model is better. I can do like hopefully like apples to apples comparison and like indeed it is better. Therefore, I will just make this transition. And then once I make this transition, the flip side of eval is like observability, right? And making sure that like the things that you formalize as like good and bad, you can kind of continually run and like monitor and make sure you improve. I think eval is the first thing, data is the second thing, right? And maybe that's related, but like a lot of the behavior of the system of these like cascading voice agents, you can look at these like both intermediate steps that they take, but also like the end output and use that as like the data is like kind of infinitely useful potentially in the future, especially if you're depending on how these like speech to speech models play out, right? That's something to make sure you kind of keep. And I think actually the last thing is that is like quite interesting is, I think this is a little bit different, but like distribution and like understanding your specific market, right? So one of the things that you said earlier is that these markets are like grouped into like a few clusters of themes, like for instance, claims, right? But like even within claims, there's like so many different types of claims, and there's I'm sure like infinite nuance with each of these submarkets. If the assumption is that it will become increasingly easier and easier to build products that quote unquote work, then your moat to some extent is like distribution and like empathy with that specific use case, right? Like what the newcomers cannot catch up to you in the people that you know and like your empathy of the problem, right? And I think maybe that is the main thing, one of the main things to kind of think about as well.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it definitely feels like we're building on sand right now, where everyone is kind of trying to skate to where the puck will be, and at the same time, not sure that it will be a puck there anymore. It might be a totally different goal. Cool. Well, congrats on the launch today. Super excited for you guys. And thanks so much for taking time to chat.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Brooke. Really excited to see what Cool will build as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks, Eric. See you.
All right. Thanks. All right. Bye.